Our next stage of the process is fermentation. We've taken our wort from the bottom of the mash tun, and it has to first pass through a heat exchanger to cool down. Remember, lots of hot water has been added to it, because now it's going to go into a vessel called, in Scotland, a washback, and yeast is going to be added. So it's got to be at a low enough temperature so as not to kill the yeast off, round about 18, 19 degrees centigrade. Yeast, our next ingredient, is marvellous stuff. We use it for making bread, use it for making beer, and effectively that's what we're doing. We're making a simple beer. Yeast loves sugar, and what we've created in the mash tun is a rich, sugary liquid. We add the yeast, and the yeast starts getting to work. Yeast explodes into that fermenter, into that washback, and it gobbles up all that sugar, and it converts that sugar into alcohol, and it belches out CO2 and heat. The fermentation process is a violent one. Whole washbacks, which are often made of wood, sometimes of stainless steel, will rock to and fro. In days of yore, because the froth kept building up and coming over the top, small boys armed with brooms would be standing there, beating the froth down. These days, a switching blade is used, which just continues to cut the froth, allowing the fermentation not to spill over the top and therefore lose valuable alcohol. The yeast type used by the Scotch whisky industry tends to be the same across every distillery. Because of this, it's generally thought that yeast doesn't contribute any unique and different characters. If, for example, we used as many different yeasts as our colleagues in bourbon do, then undoubtedly yeast would have a determining factor and an effect on the final flavour of spirit. But because everybody uses basically the same yeast, it's not considered a huge giver of overall different flavours. So yeast is working away, and after 48 hours, all that sugar has been converted into alcohol. Here's another decision point for you as a distiller. Do you then take all that wash, as it's now called, out and start distilling it, or do you leave it in your fermenter, in your washback, for a longer period of time? If you take it out just after 48 hours, guess who reappears? Our wee friend malty. So if you're wanting to make a malty or a nutty, spicy style of single malt whisky, you're going to have cloudy wort and you're going to have short fermentation. Enter the hamster cage. If, however, you want to make a different style of whisky, a style of whisky with more floral aspects, with more fruity aspects, you're going to be leaving the fermentation to run on for longer, maybe up to as much as 100 hours. What happens in the washback at that point is quite interesting, because you begin to get a build-up of bacteria called lactobacillus. It's very similar to the malolactic fermentation within wine. And during that process, as the lactobacillus begins to eat up, the sugar chains begin to change, and they change into things called esters, a group of chemicals known as esters. Don't worry about the science. Think of them as being like bananas and apples. The longer your fermentation, the more of these esters you will be producing, the more acidic the wash will become. That itself is important during distillation. So here's your other decision point during fermentation. Do you want to make it short, in which case we come back to our little hamster friend? Or do you make it long, in which case you're generating more fruity, estery aromas? The important thing to remember is that distillation, which is our next stage, is all about concentrating flavours. You're not creating many flavours, actually, within the distillation process. What you're doing is taking what is there already and squeezing it and making it more intense. Therefore, fermentation is vitally important. If you haven't created the flavour in your fermenter, then you certainly ain't going to be creating it in your still. So controlling your fermentation, making sure it's the same every single time, is vitally important in whisky. Whisky isn't like wine. Wine, the differences and the vagaries between vintages is hugely important. In a Scotch malt whisky distillery, you want to make the same flavour every single day of the year.